They laughed when she spoke, not because what she said was funny, but because her voice carried the slow, rolling cadence of rural Louisiana, thick with bayou drawl and southern honey that seemed utterly out of place in the hard-edged world of Army Rangers. They heard her accent and assumed she was soft, simple, maybe even slow. What they didn't know was that beneath that gentle exterior was a woman forged in the swamps and storms of the Deep South, someone who understood survival not as a concept taught in manuals, but as a way of life learned before she could even read. Her name was Cassidy Broussard, and she was about to prove that strength doesn't always announce itself with a roar. Sometimes it whispers with a drawl, steady and unshakable as the ancient cypress trees that lined the waters of her childhood home. Before we go any further into Cassidy's story, I want to hear from you. Before continuing, comment down below which city or country you're watching this video from. I'd love to know where in the world you are right now, and maybe you'll find others from your area in the comments too. Cassidy grew up in Terrebonne Parish, Louisiana, in a place so remote that Google Maps seemed to give up halfway through the directions. Her family lived in a weathered house on stilts, surrounded by marsh and moss-draped trees that looked like something out of a Gothic novel. Her father, Jean-Paul Broussard, was a third-generation shrimper and alligator hunter, a man whose hands were as tough as leather and whose knowledge of the bayou was legendary among the locals. Her mother, Marie, had passed away when Cassidy was only 8 years old, taken by cancer that spread faster than the kudzu vines choking the telephone poles along the parish roads. After that, it was just Cassidy, her father, and the unforgiving wilderness that surrounded them. Jean-Paul didn't believe in coddling his daughter just because she was a girl. If anything, he pushed her harder, knowing that the world wouldn't make allowances for her gender, and neither would the swamp. By the time Cassidy was 10, she could navigate the maze of waterways in complete darkness, identify every snake by its movement pattern, and field dress a deer with nothing but a hunting knife and patience. She learned to read the weather in the color of the sky, to sense danger in the sudden silence of the birds, and to move through the marsh without making a sound. Her father taught her that survival wasn't about being the biggest or the loudest. It was about being the smartest, the most patient, and the most adaptable. When Cassidy was 13, Hurricane Katrina tore through Louisiana like the wrath of God himself. Their house, built to withstand floods, held firm while others around them were swept away like matchsticks. For 3 days, Cassidy and her father sheltered in place, rationing food and water, listening to the howling wind that sounded like the earth itself was screaming. When the storm finally passed, they emerged to find their community devastated. Homes destroyed, roads impassable, people missing. Without waiting for official rescue teams that were stretched impossibly thin, Jean-Paul and Cassidy took their flat-bottom boat and began searching for survivors. For 2 weeks they pulled people from flooded attics, delivered food and medicine to stranded families, and helped coordinate makeshift relief efforts. Cassidy saw things during those weeks that would have broken most adults. She saw death, desperation, and the absolute worst of human suffering. But she also saw resilience, community, and the fierce determination of people who refused to give up. It was during this time that she first encountered U.S. Army soldiers who had been deployed to assist with rescue operations. She watched them work with a level of organization and efficiency that seemed almost miraculous amid the chaos. One soldier, a female staff sergeant named Torres, took particular interest in Cassidy, impressed by how this teenage girl navigated the disaster zone with the competence of a seasoned professional. "You ever think about joining the army, kid?" Torres had asked one evening as they unloaded supplies from a helicopter. Cassidy, muddy and exhausted, had looked up with those steady green eyes that seemed too old for her young face. "I don't know, ma'am. Never really thought I was the type." Torres had laughed at that. "The type? Honey, I've seen grown men fall apart in situations you're handling like it's a regular Tuesday. You've got something most people don't. You've got that calm in the storm. That's worth more than muscles or aggression any day." The words stuck with Cassidy long after the floodwaters receded and the soldiers moved on to the next disaster. She finished high school in a FEMA trailer, her father's shrimping business destroyed, and their community still struggling to rebuild. College wasn't an option, not with the financial reality they faced, but the army was. And more than that, it felt right. It felt like a way to take everything she'd learned in the swamps and the storms and use it to help people on a scale bigger than just her parish. So on a humid August morning, 2 weeks after her 18th birthday, Cassidy Broussard walked into the Army recruiting station in Houma, Louisiana, and signed her name on the dotted line. Basic training at Fort Jackson was both easier and harder than she'd expected. The physical challenges, the sleep deprivation, the constant pressure, none of that fazed her much. She'd grown up in an environment where comfort was a luxury and hard work was simply what you did to survive. What was harder was the social aspect. Her accent, which had never been an issue back home, immediately marked her as different. Drill sergeants mocked it. Other recruits imitated it, and more than once she heard whispered jokes about hillbillies and swamp people. Cassidy didn't rise to the bait. She'd learned from her father that the bayou taught you to be still, to observe, to let the noise pass over you like wind through the reeds. While others argued and competed for attention, Cassidy simply performed. She maxed her physical fitness tests, excelled in land navigation, and demonstrated an almost eerie ability to remain calm under pressure. Her platoon sergeant, a hard-faced woman named Drill, Sergeant Kimball, noticed. During a particularly grueling night training exercise, when half the platoon was lost and the other half was on the verge of panic, it was Cassidy who calmly assessed the situation, identified their position using nothing but a compass and the stars, and guided everyone back to the rally point. Kimball pulled her aside afterward. "Broussard, you've got a gift. You don't just react to situations, you read them. That's rare. Have you thought about what you want to do after basic?" Cassidy had thought about it. She'd thought about it every day since arriving. "I want to try for Ranger School, Drill Sergeant." The words hung in the air for a moment. Kimball's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Maybe surprise, maybe respect, maybe doubt. "Ranger School isn't like basic training, Broussard. It's designed to break you. The failure rate is over 60%, and that's for men who've been preparing for years. For women, it's even harder. Not because you can't do it, but because the institution isn't always welcoming." Cassidy met her eyes steadily. "I know, Drill Sergeant, but I didn't come here to do what was easy. I came here to see what I'm capable of." Kimball nodded slowly. "Then I'll write you a recommendation, but understand this. Once you're there, you're on your own. Your accent, your background, your gender, all of it will be used against you. You'll have to be twice as good to get half the respect. You ready for that?" Cassidy thought about the hurricane, about pulling bodies from floodwater, about her father's lessons in the swamp. "Yes, Drill Sergeant, I'm ready." After basic and advanced individual training as an infantryman, Cassidy spent 2 years with the 10th Mountain Division, deploying once to Afghanistan and proving herself in combat situations that tested every skill she'd learned. She earned her Combat Infantryman badge, the respect of her squad, and a reputation as someone who stayed cool, under fire. Her squad leader, Staff Sergeant Ramirez, was the one who finally pushed her to apply for Ranger School. "You're wasting your potential here, Broussard," he'd told her bluntly. "You've got the skills, the mindset, and the guts. Stop waiting for permission and go take what you've earned." So she applied. The packet went through channels, and 3 months later, Cassidy received her. Orders to report to Fort Benning, Georgia, for the Ranger assessment phase. She was one of only 4 women in a class of nearly 200 candidates. The other 3 were impressive: a West Point graduate, a former collegiate athlete, and a combat medic with multiple deployments. Cassidy, with her bayou drawl and her quiet demeanor, seemed out of place even among them. The first day at Ranger, school was designed to establish dominance and weed out anyone who wasn't serious. The Ranger instructors, or RIs, were some of the hardest men in the Army, veterans of multiple combat deployments who had earned their Ranger tabs through blood, sweat, and an almost superhuman level of endurance. They looked at the 4 women in the formation with expressions that ranged from skepticism to outright hostility. One RI, a muscular man with a shaved head and a voice like gravel, stopped in front of Cassidy. "Well, well, well. What do we have here? You lost, sweetheart? The administrative building is that way." Some of the male candidates snickered. Cassidy stood at attention, eyes forward, voice steady. "No, Sergeant, I'm right where I'm supposed to be." The RI leaned in close, his face inches from hers. "Is that right? And where's that? Because from where I'm standing, you look like you wandered off from a parish fair or some backwoods fishing trip." More laughter from the formation. The RI wasn't done. "Let me guess. You watched some YouTube videos, thought it looked cool, Figured you'd come out here and prove something about girl power or whatever nonsense is trending these days. Thy clothes. Cassidy didn't flinch. No, Sergeant. I'm here because I believe I can meet the standard and earn the tab. The RI circled her slowly, like a predator sizing up prey. The standard. You hear that, gentlemen? She believes she can meet the standard. Tell me something, Broussard, he said, reading her name tape. You know what the standard is? The standard is 62 days of hell. The standard is operating on 2 hours of sleep and 1 meal a day. The standard is carrying a 70-pound ruck through mountains, while people like me scream in your face and tell you you're worthless. The standard is learning to lead men who don't want to be led by you. Think your little accent and your pretty manners are going to get you through that. Cassidy finally allowed herself to meet his eyes. No, Sergeant. I think my training, my experience, and my refusal to quit will get me through that. The rest is just noise. For a moment, the RI just stared at her. Then he smiled. But it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of a man who had just found a new challenge. We'll see about that, Broussard, we'll see about that. He moved on to terrorize the next candidate, but Cassidy could feel eyes on her from all directions. The other candidates, the RIs, even the few supporters in the background. Everyone was watching to see if the girl with the drawl would break. What they didn't understand, what they couldn't understand unless they'd lived her life, was that she'd been breaking and rebuilding herself since she was a child. The swamp had taught her that survival wasn't about avoiding the storm. It was about bending with it, adapting to it, and coming out the other side stronger than before. The first week of Ranger School, known as the Ranger Assessment Phase, or RAP Week, was a crucible designed to eliminate anyone who lacked the physical fitness, mental toughness, or raw determination to continue. Candidates were subjected to endless push-ups, pull-ups, runs, and combat water survival tests, all while being constantly harassed and evaluated by the RIs. Of the 200 candidates who started, nearly 40 would be gone by the end of the first week. Cassidy attacked every event with quiet intensity. She wasn't the fastest runner, but she never quit. She wasn't the strongest on pull-ups, but she met the minimum and kept going. During the combat water survival test, where candidates had to swim 50 meters in full uniform and equipment, then tread water for 15 minutes, Cassidy's years of navigating the bayou paid off. She moved through the water with an efficiency that surprised the observers, her strokes smooth and her breathing controlled. One of the RIs, a younger sergeant named Harris, made a note on his clipboard. Broussard swims. Like she was born in the water, he muttered to another instructor. Yeah, well, swimming isn't going to help her in the mountains, the other RI replied dismissively. But it wasn't just the physical tests that mattered. RAP Week also included the Combat Water Survival Assessment, where candidates, hands and feet bound, had to enter the water, retrieve a rifle from the bottom of the pool, and then swim to the edge. It was a test of pure mental fortitude, of fighting down panic and trusting your training. Cassidy watched as several candidates before her failed, thrashing in the water or freezing up entirely. When her turn came, she stepped to the edge of the pool, her heart pounding but her mind clear. The RIs bound her wrists and ankles with thick rope. Last chance to quit, Broussard. One of them said quietly. No shame in it. This isn't for everyone. Cassidy shook her head. I'm good, Sergeant. They pushed her into the water. The shock of cold, the immediate disorientation, the primal panic of being bound and submerged, all of it hit her at once. For a split second, her mind flashed back to Hurricane Katrina, to being trapped in rising water, to the fear of drowning. But then, her father's voice echoed in her memory, calm and steady. Fear is just information, Cassie. It tells you what matters. Don't fight it. Use it. She stopped thrashing and let herself sink, her body relaxing, her mind focusing. She could see the rifle on the pool floor, maybe 8 feet down. She maneuvered her body, using small movements to propel herself downward. Her lungs burned, but she didn't panic. She reached the rifle, gripped it with her bound hands, and used her core strength to push off the bottom. Breaking the surface, she sucked in air, then began the slow, awkward swim to the pool's edge. The rifle clutched against her chest. She reached the wall and hauled herself out, water streaming from her uniform, chest heaving but eyes clear. The RIs exchanged glances. Harris made another note. By the end of RAP Week, 2 of the 4 women had been eliminated. The West Point graduate had failed the 12-mile ruck march due to a stress fracture, and the combat medic had voluntarily withdrawn after struggling with the water confidence test. That left Cassidy and the former athlete, a woman named Jenkins who was tall, powerful, and intensely competitive. Jenkins and Cassidy couldn't have been more different. Where Jenkins was aggressive and vocal, constantly pushing herself into leadership roles and making her presence known, Cassidy remained quiet, observant, and consistent. Jenkins saw Cassidy's quietness as weakness. During a rare break, as candidates were cleaning weapons and preparing gear, Jenkins made her opinion known. "You know you're making the rest of us look bad, right, Broussard?" Cassidy looked up from the rifle she was disassembling. "How's that?" Jenkins leaned against the table, arms crossed. "Because you're too passive. You never step up, never volunteer for anything, never show fire. The RIs are going to think all women are like that, and it's going to reflect on me too." Cassidy carefully laid out the rifle parts in order. "I step up when it matters. I don't see the need to volunteer for extra smoke sessions just to prove I'm tough. I'd rather save my energy for when it counts." Jenkins scoffed. "That's the problem with people like you. You don't understand that perception matters as much as performance. If you're not loud about what you can do, people assume you can't do anything." Cassidy met her eyes calmly. "With respect, Jenkins, I'm not here to perform for anyone. I'm here to earn the tab. If I do that by staying quiet and consistent, that's my choice." The tension between them was palpable, but before it could escalate, an RI appeared in the doorway. "Broussard, Jenkins, you've got 30 seconds to get your gear and fall in outside. We're moving to the next phase." The Derby phase, named after William Derby, the founder of the modern Rangers, was where the real training began. Candidates were taught small unit tactics, patrolling techniques, demolitions, and combat operations. They were constantly tested on their ability to lead and to follow, often on less than 2 hours of sleep and minimal food. The RIs rotated leadership positions, forcing every candidate to take turns leading patrols through the thick forests of Fort Benning. When Cassidy's turn came to lead, she was given a mission brief that was intentionally vague and time-constrained. Her squad, a mix of male candidates who ranged from indifferent to openly hostile about being led by a woman, looked at her with skepticism. One candidate, a former Marine named Kowalski, didn't even try to hide his disdain. "Great, we got the swamp. Girl, this is going to be a disaster." Cassidy ignored the comment and studied the map. "Listen up. We've got a reconnaissance patrol to a suspected enemy position. Time is limited, so we're going to move fast and quiet. Kowalski, your point. Martinez, rear security. Everyone else, maintain dispersion and watch your sectors. Questions?" Kowalski crossed his arms. "Yeah, I got a question. What makes you think you can lead this patrol when half of us have more combat experience than you?" Cassidy looked at him evenly. "Because the RI put me in charge, and we don't have time for you to question every decision. You can either follow my lead, and maybe we all pass this evolution, or you can keep running your mouth and guarantee we all fail. Your choice." The squad exchanged glances. Kowalski looked like he wanted to argue, but another candidate, a Ranger-qualified soldier named Thompson, who had recycled back through the course due to injury, spoke up. "She's right. Let's just get this done." They moved out into the forest. The terrain was unforgiving, thick with underbrush and fallen trees, the Georgia heat turning the air into a wet blanket that made every breath feel like drowning. Cassidy navigated with confidence, using terrain features and her compass to stay on course. When they reached a danger area, a small creek that had to be crossed, she called a halt and assessed the situation. The standard procedure was to establish security, send a recon element across, then move the squad. But Cassidy noticed something the others hadn't. The creek bent sharply about 50 meters to their left, creating a natural crossing point that was less exposed and offered better cover. "We're going to shift left and cross at the bend," she said quietly. Kowalski immediately objected. "That's not the standard procedure. We cross at the designated point." Cassidy shook her head. "The designated point is a kill zone. Look at the sight lines. If there was an actual enemy out there, they'd have that crossing zeroed in. We adapt to the terrain, not the other way around." Thompson nodded in agreement. "She's right. That's good tactical thinking." They crossed at the bend without incident, completed the reconnaissance, and made it back to the patrol base ahead of schedule. The RI who had been shadowing them, Sergeant Harris, made notes but said nothing. When they returned, he called Cassidy aside. "Broussard, that creek crossing. You deviated from standard procedure." Cassidy stood at attention. Yes, Sergeant. The terrain dictated a better option. Harris studied her for a long moment. In a real-world scenario, that kind of adaptability saves lives. But in Ranger School, we're testing your ability to follow doctrine first, adapt second. You understand the difference? Cassidy nodded. Yes, Sergeant. But with respect, doctrine exists to give us a foundation. If we follow it blindly without reading the situation, we're not really leading. We're just following a checklist. Harris almost smiled. Almost. Interesting perspective. Carry on, Broussard. As she walked away, Cassidy knew she was walking a fine line. The RIs wanted to see adherence to standards, but they also wanted to see thinking soldiers who could adapt under pressure. It was a balance and not everyone could manage it. That night, as the platoon ate their meager meal of MREs and prepared for another night patrol, Cassidy sat with her back against a tree, her body aching and her mind exhausted. Jenkins approached, her expression less hostile than before. That crossing. Today, that was smart. Cassidy looked up, surprised. Thanks. Jenkins sat down next to her. Look, I know I've been riding you, it's just, I feel like I have to be perfect, you know? Like if I mess up, it's not just me failing. It's every woman who comes after me. Cassidy understood that pressure intimately. I get it. But we can't carry all that weight and still perform. We just have to do our best and let the results speak for themselves. Jenkins was quiet for a moment, then nodded. Maybe you're right. Maybe your way isn't so bad after all. It wasn't quite friendship, but it was a truce, and in Ranger School, that was worth its weight in gold. As the days turned into weeks, Cassidy continued to perform consistently. She wasn't flashy, didn't seek attention, but she was always there, always reliable, always meeting the standard. The RIs began to take notice not because she demanded it, but because her quiet competence was impossible to ignore. Candidates who had initially dismissed her began to request her for their squads, knowing that she wouldn't panic, wouldn't quit, and wouldn't let ego get in the way of mission success. But Cassidy knew that the hardest tests were still ahead. The Derby phase was just the beginning. Next came the mountain phase, where they would be tested in the rugged terrain of North Georgia, and after that, the Florida phase, where exhaustion and exposure would push every candidate to the absolute edge of human endurance. The real question wasn't whether she could meet the standard. The question was whether the institution would let her, or whether the combination of her accent, her gender, and her quiet nature would be used against her by those who didn't want to see her succeed. Only time would tell. And in Ranger School, time was measured not in hours or days, but in moments of crisis, where everything hung in the balance. Cassidy Broussard was about to face those moments head-on, with nothing but her training, her heart, and the lessons learned in the Louisiana swamps to guide her through. The mountains of North Georgia rose from the morning mist like ancient sentinels, their peaks shrouded in clouds that promised cold rain and misery. The mountain phase of Ranger School was legendary for breaking even the strongest candidates, not through any single impossible task, but through the accumulated weight of exhaustion, hunger and terrain that punished every mistake. Cassidy stood in formation with the remaining candidates, her body already aching from the Derby phase, knowing that what lay ahead would make everything before seem like a warm-up. Of the nearly 200 candidates who had started, only about 120 remained. Jenkins had made it through Derby, as had Kowalski, Thompson, and most of the candidates who had learned to work with Cassidy rather than against her. But the mountain phase would test them all in new ways, and the RIs had made it clear that this was where the real attrition would begin. The senior RI for the mountain phase was a man named Sergeant First Class Dalton, a career ranger with multiple combat deployments and a reputation for being absolutely uncompromising. He was tall and lean, with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite, and eyes that seemed to see right through any facade. When he addressed the formation that first morning, his voice cut through the cold air like a blade. Welcome to the mountains, Rangers, and I use that term loosely because none of you have earned the right to call yourselves Rangers yet. Some of you won't. Some of you will quit, some of you will fail, and a very, very small number of you will make it through to the other side. The mountains don't care about your feelings, your background, or your excuses. The mountains only care about one thing. Can you perform when everything hurts, when you can't remember the last time you slept, When your body is telling you to quit and your mind is begging you to listen? We're about to find out. His eyes swept across the formation and landed on Cassidy. He walked over slowly, deliberately, and stopped directly in front of her. Broussard, I've read your file. I've read the assessments from Darby. You know what they say? Cassidy kept her eyes forward. No, Sergeant. Dalton leaned in slightly. They say you're competent, steady, reliable. You know what they don't say? They don't say you're exceptional. They don't say you're a leader. They say you're adequate. And adequate doesn't cut it in the mountains, Broussard. Adequate gets people killed. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to get every hard mission, every leadership position, every test I can throw at you. And if you're truly Ranger material, you'll rise to it. If you're just adequate, you'll break. Either way, we'll know the truth by the end of this phase. He stepped back and raised his voice to address everyone. That goes for all of you. The easy part is over. Welcome to the real Ranger School. The first mission in the mountains was a movement to contact patrol, meaning the squad had to patrol through difficult terrain until they encountered a simulated enemy force, then react appropriately. Cassidy was assigned as the patrol leader, exactly as Dalton had promised. Her squad consisted of 10 candidates, including Kowalski, who still hadn't fully warmed to the idea of being led by her, and a new face, a Special Forces candidate named Captain Morrison who had recycled from a previous class due to a failed patrol. Morrison was older, more experienced, and carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing left to prove. When Cassidy began her mission brief, laying out the route, formations, and contingency plans, Morrison listened without comment, but she could feel him evaluating every word. The patrol began before dawn, the temperature hovering just above freezing, their breath forming clouds in the darkness. Cassidy led them up a steep incline, navigating by terrain association and her compass, the 65-pound ruck on her back feeling like it gained weight with every step. Behind her, she could hear the labored breathing of her squad, the occasional muttered curse when someone slipped on loose rocks. 2 hours into the patrol, as they were moving through a particularly dense section of forest, Cassidy heard it, a sound that didn't belong. She raised her fist, the signal to halt, and the squad froze instantly. She strained to listen, filtering out the wind in the trees and the sound of her own heartbeat. There it was again. Voices. Simulated enemy forces were closer than intelligence had indicated. She had two choices: try to bypass the enemy position and continue to the objective, or engage and clear the threat. Both options carried risks. Bypassing might work, but if they were spotted, they'd be caught in the open. Engaging would alert other enemy forces in the area, but would eliminate an immediate threat. She made her decision quickly. Using hand signals, she positioned her squad in a hasty ambush formation, placing her best marksmen in overwatch positions and preparing the assault element. Kowalski, positioned near her, whispered harshly, "This is a mistake, we should bypass." Cassidy ignored him and gave the signal to initiate the ambush. The simulated firefight was chaos controlled by training. Blank rounds cracked through the forest, smoke grenades billowed, and candidates moved with practiced aggression through the enemy position. It was over in less than 3 minutes. The RI evaluators, who had been watching from the shadows, called an end to the exercise and gathered the squad. Sergeant Dalton emerged from the tree line, his expression unreadable. "Broussard, explain your decision to engage rather than bypass." Cassidy stood at attention, her uniform soaked with sweat despite the cold. "Sergeant, the enemy position was too close to our route. Attempting to bypass risked compromise. Engaging eliminated the immediate threat and allowed us to continue the mission." Dalton nodded slowly. "And the cost? You just announced your presence to every enemy unit in the area. Your element of surprise is gone." Cassidy met his eyes. "Yes, Sergeant, but my squad is intact and we're still moving toward the objective. In a real-world scenario, I'd rather deal with a known threat than leave an enemy force at my back." Dalton studied her for a long moment, then turned to the squad. "Anyone disagree with Patrol Leader Broussard's assessment?" Kowalski raised his hand. "I do, Sergeant. We should have bypassed. We had the capability." Dalton looked at him. "And if you'd been spotted during the bypass, what then?" Kowalski hesitated. "Then we'd engage from a position of disadvantage." Dalton nodded. "Exactly. Broussard made a tactical decision based on terrain, enemy disposition, and her assessment of her squad's capabilities. It may not have been the textbook answer, but it was a thinking soldier's answer. That's what we want to see. Continue mission. As they moved out, Captain Morrison fell into step beside Cassidy. That was good. Leadership, he said quietly. You didn't second-guess yourself and you didn't let Kowalski get in your head. Cassidy glanced at him. You would have made a different call. Morrison smiled slightly. Maybe. Maybe not. The point is you made a call and owned it. That's what matters. But not everyone saw it that way. That night, as the squad set up a patrol base and began preparing for the next mission, Cassidy overheard a conversation between several candidates who thought she was out of earshot. She's going to get us all recycled, one of them muttered. Every time she leads, she makes these aggressive calls. It's like she's trying to prove something. Another voice, which Cassidy recognized as Kowalski, responded. That's exactly what she's doing. She knows she's being watched extra. Close because she's a woman, so she's overcompensating. Problem is, she's going to take us down with her. A third candidate, someone Cassidy didn't recognize, added, I don't know, man. The RIs seem to like her calls. Dalton didn't shut her down today. Kowalski scoffed. Dalton's just being politically correct. You know how it is these days. They can't fail her too obviously, or there'll be hell to pay from the brass. But just watch. When it really matters, when the mission is complex enough that she can't hide behind aggression, she'll crack. That Southern Belle Act only goes so far. The words stung more than Cassidy wanted to admit. Not because she believed them, but because she knew others did. She was being held to an impossible standard. Too aggressive meant she was. Overcompensating, too cautious meant she was weak. Too quiet meant she wasn't a leader. Too vocal meant she was trying too hard. There was no winning, only surviving. She pushed the thoughts aside and focused on preparing her gear for the next day. Captain Morrison appeared beside her, his expression knowing. Heard them talking. Cassidy didn't look up from the ruck she was packing. Doesn't matter. Morrison sat down on a nearby log. It does matter, Broussard, not because they're right, but because that kind of talk can poison a squad if you let it fester. You want my advice? Cassidy paused. Sure. Morrison leaned forward, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Stop trying to lead everyone. You can't. Some of these guys will never accept you no matter what you do. What you can do is lead the ones who are willing to be led. Thompson respects you. Jenkins has come around. Even some of the younger guys see that you know what you're doing. Focus on them. Build a core of people who trust you, and the rest will either fall in line or fail out on their own. It was solid advice, and Cassidy knew it. She nodded slowly. Thanks, Morrison. He stood up, slinging his ruck. Over one shoulder. Don't thank me yet. The hardest part is still coming. These mountain missions only get worse from here. He was right. Over the next 2 weeks, the missions became progressively more complex, and the conditions more brutal. They conducted night ambushes in freezing rain, executed raids on fortified positions with minimal intelligence, and led movement to contact patrols through terrain so steep that every step felt like climbing a wall. Sleep became a memory, food a distant luxury. Candidates began to break down, physically and mentally. Some quit outright, ringing the bell and accepting defeat. Others failed to meet standards on critical tasks and were dropped from the course. Jenkins, the former athlete who had made it through Derby with Cassidy, finally hit her breaking point during a particularly brutal night patrol. She had been struggling with a recurring knee injury, and when the patrol leader, a Marine captain, pushed the pace too hard, something in Jenkins' knee gave out completely. Cassidy watched as Jenkins collapsed on the trail, tears of frustration streaming down her face, not from pain, but from the knowledge that her ranger school journey was over. I can make it, Jenkins insisted as the medics examined her. Just tape it up, I can push through. But the senior RI shook his head. You're done, Jenkins. Medical drop. You'll get a chance to recycle if you want, but this class is over for you. As they helped Jenkins down the mountain, Cassidy felt the weight of being the last woman standing in the class. Every decision she made now would be scrutinized not just as her own, but as representative of whether women belonged in ranger school at all. It was unfair, irrational, and absolutely real. The breaking point came during a mission that would later be referred to among the candidates simply as the Nightmare Patrol. Cassidy was again assigned as patrol leader, this time for an extremely complex mission, a 12-kilometer movement through the worst terrain in the training area, followed by a hasty ambush, followed by immediate extract under simulated enemy pursuit. The time window was impossibly tight, the terrain was brutal, and the weather forecast called for heavy rain and possible lightning. Sergeant Dalton delivered the mission brief with his characteristic bluntness. "Broussard, this mission has a 90% failure rate. Most patrol leaders either miss the time hack, botch the ambush, or lose control of their squad during the extract. If you complete all phases successfully, you'll be one of maybe 5 candidates this year to do so. If you fail, you'll be recycled and have to start the mountain phase over from the beginning. Questions?" Cassidy studied the map, her mind already working through possible routes and contingencies. "What's the enemy strength at the ambush site?" Dalton smiled coldly. "Unknown. You'll find out when you get there. That's why it's called reconnaissance. Anything else?" Cassidy shook her head. "No, Sergeant. We'll get it done." Dalton's smile faded. "We'll see." The patrol began at 200 hours in a cold rain that soaked through every layer of clothing. Within minutes, Cassidy led her squad of 10 exhausted, hungry candidates up a mountainside so steep they had to use trees and roots to pull themselves forward. Behind her, she could hear grunts of effort, the occasional slip and curse, and the constant whispered commentary from Kowalski about how they were already behind schedule, and this route was wrong. 3 hours into the movement, as they were traversing a particularly dangerous section of trail that ran along a cliff face, one of the candidates, a younger soldier named Private First Class Chen, slipped. He fell backward, his ruck's weight pulling him toward the edge. Without thinking, Cassidy lunged and grabbed his kit, her fingers closing around the carrying handle just as Chen's feet went over the edge. For a terrifying moment, they were both suspended, Cassidy's weight barely enough to counterbalance Chen dangling in space. "Pull!" she shouted, and the rest of the squad rushed forward, grabbing Chen and hauling him back onto the trail. He lay there gasping, his eyes wide with shock. "You saved my life," he managed to say between breaths. Cassidy helped him to his feet. "You would have done the same. Now let's move. We're burning time." But the incident had cost them precious minutes, and when they finally reached the area where they needed to set up the ambush, they were already 15 minutes behind schedule. Worse, when Cassidy scouted the ambush site, she discovered that the terrain was nothing like what the map had indicated. The trail the enemy was supposed to use was washed out, forcing them to either relocate the entire ambush or try to predict where the enemy would actually move. Kowalski immediately voiced his opinion. "We need to abort. There's no way we can set up an effective ambush in time. We should move to the extract point and call it." Several other candidates nodded in agreement. They were cold, exhausted, and demoralized. The easy answer was to quit. Cassidy looked at the terrain, her mind racing. Then she saw it, a secondary trail, barely visible, that cut through a narrow defile. If the enemy was moving through this area and their primary route was blocked, that's where they'd go. It was a gamble, but it was the only option that gave them a chance to complete the mission. "We're relocating to that defile," she said, pointing. "We've got 10 minutes to get into position. Move fast and quiet." Kowalski stepped in front of her. "This is insane. You're guessing. If you're wrong, we all fail." Cassidy met his eyes with a calm that surprised even herself. "I'm not guessing. I'm reading the terrain. Now you can either trust me and help set up this ambush, or you can stand here arguing and guarantee we fail. Your choice, Kowalski." For a long moment, they stared at each other, the rain streaming down their faces. Then Captain Morrison spoke up from behind them. "She's right about the terrain. That's where I'd route an element too. Let's do this." Thompson nodded in agreement. "I'm with Broussard." Slowly, reluctantly, Kowalski stepped aside. "Fine. But when this fails, it's on you." They moved quickly, positioning themselves in the defile with overlapping fields of fire. Cassidy placed her automatic rifleman in a position where he could cover the entire kill zone, positioned her security elements to prevent enemy escape, and made sure everyone understood the initiation signal. Then they waited. 5 minutes passed. 10. 15. The rain intensified, turning the defile into a stream. Some of the candidates began to shift nervously. Maybe Kowalski had been right. Maybe this was a mistake. Then Cassidy heard it, the sound of movement, voices speaking in low tones, the clink of equipment. She raised her hand, every muscle tensed. The simulated enemy patrol appeared at the entrance to the defile, exactly where she had predicted. She gave the signal and her squad initiated the ambush with disciplined precision. Blank rounds echoed off the narrow walls. creating a cacophony that would have been devastating in a real firefight. The enemy force, caught completely by surprise in a perfect kill zone, had no chance. It was over in seconds. The RI evaluator, who had been shadowing them, called end of exercise and approached Cassidy. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. Finally, he keyed his radio. "Dalton, this is Shadow 2. You need to see this." 5 minutes later, Sergeant Dalton appeared, looking irritated at being summoned. The evaluator briefed him quickly on what had happened: the route change, Chen's near fall, the flooded ambush site, Cassidy's decision to relocate, and the successful ambush that followed. Dalton listened without interrupting, then turned to Cassidy. "You relocated the entire ambush site based on terrain analysis, with 15 minutes to execute in conditions like this?" Cassidy nodded. "Yes, Sergeant." Dalton looked at the terrain, at the kill zone, at the positions her squad had occupied. Then he did something Cassidy had never seen him do before. He smiled. Not a cold smile or a mocking smile, but a genuine smile of respect. "Outstanding work. Broussard, that was Ranger-level thinking under pressure. You just passed the Nightmare Patrol. Congratulations." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Cassidy couldn't quite process them. She had done it. She had completed the mission that 90% of patrol leaders failed. Behind her, she heard Chen say quietly, "Told you she knew what she was doing." Even Kowalski was silent, his earlier criticism forgotten in the face of undeniable success. But Dalton wasn't finished. He gathered the squad together. "Listen up. What patrol leader Broussard just demonstrated is the difference between someone who can follow a checklist and someone who can actually lead. When the plan fell apart, she didn't quit. She didn't make excuses. She assessed, adapted, and executed. That's what we're looking for. That's what makes a Ranger. Some of you supported her. Some of you doubted her. But all of you just learned what right looks like. Carry on." As they moved toward the extract point, Cassidy felt something shift within her. The doubt that had plagued her since the beginning, the constant worry that maybe she didn't belong, began to fade. She wasn't just adequate. She wasn't just meeting the standard. She was exceeding it. And more importantly, she was proving it in the only way that mattered, through performance under pressure. That night, back at the patrol base, Captain Morrison approached her with 2 other candidates. "Broussard, we want to request you as patrol leader for our next mission. All 3 of us." Cassidy looked surprised. "You don't have to do that. Our eyes assign leadership." Morrison shook his head. "They give us input. And our input is that we want someone who actually knows how to lead when things go sideways. That's you." It was a moment of validation that meant more than any praise from an instructor. These were her peers, experienced soldiers who had seen her at her worst and at her best, and they were choosing to follow her. Over the final week of the mountain phase, Cassidy led 3 more patrols, each one successful, each one building her reputation as a calm, competent leader who could be trusted in crisis. Other candidates began to seek her advice during mission planning, asking how she analyzed terrain or made decisions under pressure. She became, quietly and without fanfare, one of the go-to leaders in the class. But not everyone was happy about it. Sergeant Dalton called her into his office on the last day of the mountain phase. "Sit down, Broussard." She sat, wondering if she had somehow screwed up without realizing it. Dalton leaned back in his chair, studying her. "You're about to head into the Florida phase, which is its own special kind of hell. Swamps, heat, humidity, and exhaustion that makes the mountains. Look easy. Before you go, I want to tell you something." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "When you first got here, I didn't think you'd make it. Not because you weren't capable, but because I've seen too many candidates, male and female, who were capable but couldn't handle the institutional resistance that comes with being different. You proved me wrong. You didn't just survive the mountains. You excelled. Your peer evaluations are among the highest in the class. Your leadership evaluations are solid. You've earned the respect of people who didn't want to give it." Cassidy didn't know what to say. "Thank you, Sergeant." Dalton held up a hand. "I'm not done. I'm telling you this because Florida is where they're going to try to break you. The RIs down there already know your name. They know you're the last woman in the class. Some of them will want to see you succeed, others will want to see you fail because they don't believe women belong in this course. You're going to face challenges that have nothing to do with your performance and everything to do with politics and prejudice. Are you ready for that?" Cassidy thought about her father, about the swamps of Louisiana, about Hurricane Katrina, and all the times people had underestimated her because of her accent or her gender. "I've been dealing with that my whole life, Sergeant. I'm ready." Dalton nodded slowly. "Then go down there and prove them wrong too. You've come too far to quit now." As Cassidy left his office, she felt the weight of what lay ahead. The Florida phase would be the final test, the last crucible before earning the Ranger tab. But it would also be the most dangerous, not because of the physical challenges, but because of the human ones. People who wanted her to fail, people who would look for any excuse to say she didn't belong. She thought about Jenkins, who had been medically dropped. She thought about the other 2 women who hadn't made it through Rap Week. She was carrying their hopes now, along with her own. The burden should have felt crushing. Instead, it felt like purpose. Because Cassidy Broussard had learned something in the mountains of North Georgia, something that no amount of prejudice or institutional resistance could take away. She had learned that she belonged, not because anyone gave her permission, but because she had earned it through sweat, sacrifice, and an absolute refusal to quit, and she was going to finish what she started no matter who tried to stop her. The graduation ceremony at Fort Benning was held on a crisp morning in October, the Georgia sky clear and blue, the air finally cool after months of brutal heat. Rows of chairs were arranged on the parade field, filled with families, friends, and senior military leaders who had come to witness the pinning of the tan and black Ranger tab, one of the most respected symbols in the United States Army. Of the nearly 200 candidates who had started the course 62 days earlier, only 73 remained. Cassidy Broussard stood in formation with her fellow graduates, her dress uniform crisp and clean, so different from the mud-caked, sweat-soaked fatigues she'd worn for the past 2 months. Her father had made the journey from Louisiana, his weathered face showing pride that he would never put into words, but that Cassidy could read as clearly as she read the swamps back home. When her name was called and she stepped forward to receive her tab, the applause was thunderous. Captain Morrison, who had graduated alongside her, started it, but it spread. Through the entire formation of graduates, their cheers echoing across the parade field. Even Master Sergeant Carver, standing with the other Ranger instructors, allowed himself a slight smile. The Ranger School Commandant, a full colonel with multiple combat deployments, pinned the tab on Cassidy's shoulder himself. He leaned in and spoke quietly enough that only she could hear. "Ranger, Broussard, you didn't just earn this tab. You elevated the standard for everyone who comes after you. The Army is watching and they're impressed. Congratulations." Cassidy saluted crisply. "Thank you, sir. It's an honor." As she returned to formation, she caught her father's eye in the crowd. He nodded once, a simple gesture that meant everything. She had made him proud. She had honored his memory and the lessons he'd taught her. That evening, at the informal celebration that followed the ceremony, Cassidy found herself surrounded by her fellow Rangers, all of them still processing what they'd accomplished. Thompson raised his beer in a toast. "To Broussard, who taught us all that being a Ranger isn't about being the loudest or the biggest. It's about being the smartest and the most determined." They drank to that, and Kowalski, now fully converted from skeptic to supporter, added his own tribute. "I'll admit, when we started, I didn't think you belonged here. I was an idiot. You belong here more than most of us do. You earned every bit of that tab." But the celebration was short-lived. The world had not stopped turning while they were in Ranger School, and conflicts around the globe still demanded America's most elite soldiers. Within a week of graduation, Cassidy received her next assignment. 75th Ranger Regiment, 2nd Battalion, stationed at Joint Base Lewis McChord in Washington State. The 75th was the premier light infantry unit in the Army, the direct descendants of the Rangers who had stormed the beaches of Normandy and the cliffs of Pointe du Hoc. To be assigned there straight out of Ranger School was both an honor and a massive challenge. She would be one of the few women in the regiment and the first female graduate of Ranger School to serve in an operational Ranger battalion. The scrutiny would be intense, the expectations impossibly high, and the margin for error non-existent. Cassidy reported to 2nd Battalion in early November, her duffel, bag slung over her shoulder, ready for whatever came next. The battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Stone, was a legend in the Ranger community, a combat veteran with 3 deployments to Afghanistan and 2 to Iraq. He called Cassidy into his office on her first day. "Ranger Broussard, welcome to the regiment." Stone was direct, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had led soldiers in the worst conditions imaginable. I've read your file. I've read the after-action reports from your Ranger School performance. I've also fielded about a dozen calls from people with opinions about whether you should be here. Some think you're a trailblazer. Others think you're a political statement. I don't care about either perspective. What I care about is whether you can do the job. Can you lead Rangers in combat? Can you make life or death decisions under fire? Can you earn the trust of soldiers who will follow you into hell if you ask them to? Cassidy met his gaze steadily. Yes, sir, I can. Stone nodded slowly. Then that's all that matters. You'll be assigned to Alpha Company as a platoon leader. Your platoon sergeant is Staff Sergeant David Chen, 10 years in regiment, multiple deployments, and he doesn't suffer fools. He'll test you, same as everyone else will. Prove yourself to him, and the rest will fall into place. Dismissed. Staff Sergeant Chen was exactly as advertised. Hard, experienced, and utterly unimpressed by Cassidy's Ranger tab or her reputation from school. When they met for the first time, he looked her up and down with an expression that revealed nothing. Ma'am, I've served under 12 different platoon leaders in my career. Some were good, most were adequate, a few were dangerous. I don't know which category you fall into yet, but I'll figure it out fast. My job is to keep these Rangers alive and mission capable. Your job is to lead them. We understand each other. Cassidy nodded. We do, Sergeant. And for what it's worth, I'm not here to prove anything except that I can do the job. I'll listen to your experience, I'll trust your judgment, and I'll make decisions based on what's best for the mission and the platoon. If I screw up, tell me. If I'm about to make a bad call, stop me. I'd rather have my ego bruised than get someone killed because I was too proud to listen. Chen's expression softened just slightly. That's a better answer than most new LTs give. Okay, ma'am, let's see what you've got. The platoon itself was a mix of seasoned Rangers and newer soldiers, all of them watching Cassidy with varying degrees of curiosity, skepticism, and reservation. She knew she would have to earn their trust one day at a time, one training exercise at a time, one decision at a time. There were no shortcuts. Over the next 4 months, Cassidy threw herself into training with an intensity that impressed even the most hardened veterans in the battalion. She attended every range session, every tactical exercise, every briefing. She studied previous deployment after-action reports, learned from the mistakes and successes of those who had gone before her, and built relationships with her Rangers through shared suffering in the field. Staff Sergeant Chen, true to his word, tested her constantly. He would present her with tactical problems during training, scenarios where there was no clear right answer, and watch how she processed information and made decisions. Slowly, grudgingly, he began to respect what he saw. Ma'am's got a good tactical mind, he told the platoon one evening after a particularly complex training exercise. She doesn't panic. She listens to input and she makes timely decisions. That's what we need. In March, 6 months after Cassidy had arrived at the regiment, the battalion received deployment orders. They were heading to Afghanistan, to a province along the Pakistan border, where Taliban and Al-Qaeda forces had regrouped and were launching attacks on coalition forces and Afghan civilians. The deployment brief was sobering. High-intensity combat operations, mountainous terrain, and an enemy that knew the ground better than any American ever would. Alpha Company would be conducting direct action raids, targeted strikes against high-value targets, and supporting Special Operations Task Force missions across the region. This was what Cassidy had trained for, what she'd endured Ranger School to be ready for. But knowing that and experiencing it were two very different things. The platoon deployed in early April, flying into Bagram Airfield and then helicoptering to Forward Operating Base Shank, a remote outpost surrounded by mountains and danger. The base was austere, the accommodations Spartan, and the operational tempo relentless. Within 48 hours of arriving, Cassidy's platoon conducted their first combat mission. It was a night raid on a compound suspected of housing a Taliban commander, responsible for coordinating attacks on Afghan government officials. The planning was meticulous, the rehearsals thorough, and the execution textbook perfect. They infilled via helicopter, breached the compound, secured the target, and extracted without casualties. It was a successful first mission, but Cassidy knew it was just the beginning. Over the next 3 months, the platoon conducted dozens of missions. Some were routine, almost boring in their predictability. Others were chaotic firefights, where split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death. Cassidy learned to trust her instincts, to read the battlefield the same way. She'd learned to read the swamps of Louisiana and the mountains of Georgia. She earned the respect of her rangers, not through speeches or bravado, but through competence under fire and a willingness to share the same risks they faced. Staff Sergeant Chen, after their 15th mission together, pulled her aside. "Ma'am, you're doing good work. The Rangers trust you. That's not something I say lightly." But the defining moment of Cassidy's deployment, the mission that would become legend within the regiment and beyond, came in late June during what was supposed to be a routine reconnaissance patrol. Intelligence had indicated possible enemy activity in a valley about 15 kilometers from their forward operating base, and Cassidy's platoon was tasked with conducting a presence patrol, showing force and gathering information. It should have been straightforward. It wasn't. The patrol moved through the valley in standard formation, Cassidy positioned with the command element in the center, Chen running the lead squad, when the world exploded. The ambush was perfectly executed, a classic L-shaped formation that caught the platoon in a kill zone with enemy fire coming from two directions. RPGs streaked through the air, machine gun fire tore through the rocks around them, and within seconds, 3 Rangers were wounded, 1 critically. The radio crackled with overlapping transmissions, contact reports, casualty updates, requests for air support. It was chaos, the kind of situation that could spiral out of control in heartbeats if leadership froze. Cassidy didn't freeze. Years of training, months of combat experience, and a lifetime of learning to stay calm under pressure all coalesced into crystal-clear thought. She assessed the situation in seconds. They were pinned down in bad terrain with limited cover. The enemy had the high ground and superior firing positions, and her wounded Rangers needed immediate medical evacuation, or they would die. Standard doctrine would be to suppress the enemy, break contact, and call for close air support to destroy the ambush positions. But Cassidy saw something the enemy didn't expect her to see. The ambush was positioned to push them backward, away from the high ground, toward a secondary kill zone where more enemy fighters were probably waiting. If they retreated, they would be slaughtered. The only way out was forward, straight into the teeth of the ambush, taking the high ground that the enemy assumed they couldn't reach. It was insane. It was also the only option that gave them a chance. She keyed her radio, her voice cutting through the chaos with absolute calm. "All Viper elements, this is Viper 6. Prepare to assault through the ambush on my command. First squad, suppress left flank. Second squad, you're assaulting right with me. Third squad, security on R6 and prepare to move casualties. Medics, stay with the wounded until we secure the high ground. Chen, you copy?" Staff Sergeant Chen's voice came back immediately, steady despite the gunfire. "Copy all, ma'am. First squad moving to suppress." Cassidy turned to her radio operator. "Tell headquarters we're assaulting through and we'll need immediate medevac once we secure the high ground. And get those gunships inbound now." She didn't wait for confirmation. She rose from cover, her rifle at the ready, and started moving forward toward the enemy positions. "Second squad, on me. Move, move, move." The Rangers of second squad, trusting their platoon leader with their lives, rose and followed her into the fire. What happened next would be analyzed in after-action reports, taught at Ranger School, and recounted in bars wherever Rangers gathered for years to come. Cassidy led the assault with a controlled aggression that stunned the enemy fighters. She used terrain expertly, moving from cover to cover, directing her squad's fire to suppress specific enemy positions while other Rangers maneuvered. When an enemy machine gun position threatened to stop their advance, Cassidy personally flanked it, using a creek bed as concealment, and eliminated the threat with precise rifle fire that would have made her Ranger School instructors proud. Behind her, second squad moved like a well-oiled machine, covering each other's movements, communicating with hand signals and shouted commands, trusting that their lieutenant knew what she was doing. And she did. Within 8 minutes of initiating the assault, they had reached the high ground, overrun the enemy positions, and turned the ambush inside out. The remaining enemy fighters, caught completely off guard by the ferocity and audacity of the counterattack, broke and fled. First squad secured the left flank, third squad moved the wounded Rangers to a landing zone that Cassidy had identified, and within 20 minutes, medevac helicopters were landing to evacuate the casualties. All 3 wounded Rangers survived. 0 Ranger fatalities. Enemy casualties were estimated at 15 killed and unknown wounded. The ambush that should have destroyed the platoon had instead been defeated through aggressive leadership and Rangers who trusted their leader enough to follow her into hell. When they returned to the forward operating base, Lieutenant Colonel Stone was waiting. He pulled Cassidy aside, away from the celebration and the adrenaline-fueled debriefs. "Ranger Broussard, I just got off the phone with the task force commander. He wants a full brief on what happened out there. He's calling it one of the most tactically sound counter-ambush actions he's seen in 15 years of war. Your platoon sergeant says you saved their lives. Your Rangers say you're the real deal. I'm putting you in for a Bronze Star with Valor device. You earned it." Cassidy, still covered in dust and dried sweat, shook her head slightly. "Sir, I was just doing my job. My Rangers are the ones who executed. Chen is the one who trained them to trust and move under fire. I just made a call." Stone smiled slightly. "That's exactly the kind of answer a real leader gives. But here's what I know. Making that call in that moment, under that pressure, is what separates adequate officers from exceptional ones. You're exceptional, Broussard. Don't ever doubt that." The story of the ambush spread through the battalion, then the regiment, then the broader special operations community. Cassidy Broussard, the Ranger School graduate who had faced institutional skepticism and impossible standards, had proven herself in the ultimate test: combat leadership under fire. She had saved lives through tactical brilliance and personal courage, and she had done it not despite being a woman, but simply by being an outstanding Ranger. Staff Sergeant Chen found her that evening as she was cleaning her rifle in the platoon bay. "Ma'am, can I say something?" Cassidy looked up. "Of course, Sergeant." Chen was uncharacteristically emotional. "When you first got to the platoon, I didn't know what to think. I'd never served under a female officer in combat, and I had my doubts. I'm ashamed of that now. Today, when you stood up and led that assault, you were the bravest person I've ever served with. You saved my soldiers. You saved me. I just wanted you to know that I'd follow you anywhere. And I know every Ranger in this platoon feels the same way." Cassidy felt her throat tighten with emotion, but she kept her voice steady. "Sergeant Chen, I couldn't do any of this without you. You trained these Rangers, you've guided me since day one, and you executed flawlessly. Today, this is a team effort. Always has been." Chen nodded, but his expression made clear that he understood what she'd accomplished, even if she was too humble to accept the full weight of it. The deployment continued for another 4 months, with dozens more missions, but none quite as dramatic as the counter-ambush in June, when Alpha Company finally redeployed back to Joint Base Lewis McChord. In October, they did so with a reputation as one of the most effective platoons in the battalion, and at the center of that reputation was Lieutenant Cassidy Broussard, the Ranger from Louisiana who had proven that courage, competence, and leadership had nothing to do with gender and everything to do with character. The award ceremony was held in December, with the entire battalion in formation. As the brigade commander pinned the Bronze Star with Valor on Cassidy's dress uniform, he spoke words that echoed across the parade field. "Ranger Broussard's actions under fire exemplify the Ranger creed. Never shall I fail my comrades. She led from the front, made decisive tactical decisions under extreme pressure, and through her personal courage and professional competence saved the lives of multiple Rangers. She represents the very best of the regiment and the United States Army." The applause that followed was genuine, earned through blood and fire, respect given freely by soldiers who understood what it meant to lead in combat. Cassidy stood at attention, the medal heavy on her chest, thinking about the long journey that had brought her to this moment. From the swamps of Louisiana, to the mountains of Ranger School, from the skepticism and doubt to this moment of recognition, she had proven something important, not just to the Army, but to herself. She belonged. Not because anyone gave her permission, but because she had earned the right through sacrifice, determination, and an absolute refusal to be anything less than excellent. And as she looked out at the formation of Rangers, her Rangers, she knew that this was just the beginning. There would be more deployments, more missions, more chances to lead and to serve, and she was ready for all of it. The years that followed Cassidy's first deployment became a blur of training cycles, deployments, and missions that tested every lesson she had ever learned. She deployed twice more to Afghanistan, once to Iraq, and conducted classified operations in 3 other countries that she would never be able to discuss. Each deployment added layers to her understanding of leadership, combat, and the complex reality of modern warfare. She was promoted to captain, then to major, and eventually found herself back at Fort Benning not as a student but as an instructor at the very ranger school that had once tried to break her. It was a strange full-circle moment, standing in front of a new class of candidates as the senior female ranger instructor, looking at faces that reminded her of her own journey years before. Some eager, some terrified, some skeptical, and a handful of women who were attempting the course, their eyes searching hers for some sign that it was possible. The army had changed in the years since Cassidy had earned her tab. More women were attempting ranger school, and while the attrition rate remained brutally high for everyone, the presence of female candidates was no longer shocking. It was simply reality, but Cassidy knew that each woman who walked through those gates still carried an extra burden, still faced scrutiny that their male counterparts didn't, still had to be twice as good to earn half the respect. On her first day as an instructor, Master Sergeant Carver, now older and grayer but still commanding respect, pulled her aside. "Ranger Broussard, or I suppose I should call you Major Broussard now. It's good to have you back, though I never imagined I'd see the day when the swamp girl from Louisiana would be teaching my course." Cassidy smiled. "Life's full of surprises, Sergeant Major. I certainly never imagined it either." Carver's expression grew serious. "You know why they assigned you here, right? It's not just because you're qualified, though you certainly are. It's because those female candidates need to see that it's possible. They need to see someone who walked the same path they're walking and made it to the other side." Cassidy nodded slowly. "I understand, but I'm not going to make it easier for them. That wouldn't be doing them any favors." Carver laughed. "I wouldn't expect anything less. They'll earn the tab the same way you did, the same way everyone does, through blood, sweat, and sheer determination. But having you here, seeing what you accomplished, that's worth more than any motivational speech could ever be." Over the following months, Cassidy threw herself into the instructor role with the same intensity she brought to everything else. She was fair but demanding, never accepting excuses, but always willing to provide genuine guidance to candidates who were struggling. She pushed them to their limits, tested their resolve, and made sure that anyone who earned the Ranger tab under her watch had truly earned it. There was one candidate in particular, a young woman named Second Lieutenant Emma Rodriguez from Texas, who reminded Cassidy of herself. Rodriguez was quiet, competent, and constantly underestimated by her peers and some of the other instructors. She didn't have the flashy athletic background of some candidates or the boisterous confidence that often accompanied male rangers. What she had was an unshakable determination and a tactical mind that could see 3 moves ahead. During the mountain phase, Rodriguez was assigned as patrol leader for a particularly complex mission, and Cassidy was the evaluating RI. She watched as Rodriguez navigated the challenges with calm precision, making tactical decisions that showed real understanding of terrain and enemy disposition. But during the mission, one of the male candidates in Rodriguez's squad, a former college football player named Jackson, openly challenged her authority. "This route is wrong," Jackson announced loudly enough for the entire squad to hear. "We're wasting time. I think we should—" Rodriguez cut him off, her voice quiet but firm. "Jackson, I appreciate your input, but I've made my decision based on terrain analysis and the mission timeline. We're continuing on this route. If you have concerns, we can discuss them after the mission. Right now, I need you to focus on your sector and your responsibilities." Jackson's face flushed with anger. "Just because you've got the rank doesn't mean you know what you're doing. Some of us actually have combat experience." Before Rodriguez could respond, Cassidy stepped out from her observation position. "Candidate Jackson, fall in on me now." Jackson reluctantly complied, and Cassidy led him away from the patrol, out of earshot of the other candidates. When she turned to face him, her expression was cold. "Let me explain something to you, Jackson. What you just did isn't tactical discussion. It's insubordination. Worse, it's the kind of undermining that gets people killed in combat." Patrol leader Rodriguez made a sound tactical decision based on the information available. You don't have to like it, but you do have to follow it. That's how small unit leadership works. Jackson started to protest. "But I've been deployed. I know how this stuff works in the real world. Cassidy interrupted him. "I've been deployed 4 times to combat zones. I've led Rangers under fire. I've made decisions where people's lives hung in the balance. And you want to know what I learned? That combat experience means nothing if you can't follow and support your leaders when it's not your turn to lead. You think your deployment makes you special. Every Ranger in this course has deployed. What makes you special is how you perform here now under these conditions, and right. Now you're failing." She let that sink in, then continued. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to return to that patrol. You're going to apologize to your patrol leader for the disruption, and you're going to execute her orders to the best of your ability. If you can't do that, if your ego is too big to follow a female leader, then you don't belong in Ranger School, and you sure as hell don't belong in the regiment. Your choice." Jackson stared at her for a long moment, the internal struggle visible on his face. Finally, he nodded. "Yes, Sergeant, I understand." When they returned to the patrol, Jackson did apologize, and the mission continued without further incident. Rodriguez completed the patrol successfully, and when Cassidy debriefed her afterward, the young lieutenant's relief was palpable. "Thank you for that, Sergeant. I didn't know how to handle it." Cassidy shook her head. "You were handling it fine. You stayed calm, you didn't let him rattle you, and you stuck to your tactical plan. That's exactly what you needed to do. Jackson's problem isn't with you, it's with his own insecurity. Don't ever let someone else's issues become your burden." Rodriguez hesitated, then asked the question that Cassidy knew was coming. "How do you deal with it? The constant scrutiny, the people who don't think you belong, the pressure to be perfect." Cassidy considered her answer carefully. "I don't try to be perfect. Perfect doesn't exist. What I try to be is competent, prepared, and true to myself. I learned a long time ago that some people will never accept me. No matter what I do, I can't control that. What I can control is my performance, my integrity, and my commitment to the mission. Focus on what you can control, and let the rest go." Rodriguez nodded slowly, absorbing the advice. "One more question. Did it get easier? After Ranger School, after proving yourself, did people stop doubting?" Cassidy smiled sadly. "No, people still doubt. People still question. Even after 4 combat deployments and a Bronze Star with Valor, there are people who think I got here because of diversity initiatives or lowered standards. But here's what changed. I stopped caring about their doubt. I know who I am. I know what I've done. I know what I'm capable of, and that's enough." Rodriguez went on to graduate from Ranger School, one of 7 women in her class, to earn the tab. On graduation day, she sought out Cassidy. "Ma'am, I just wanted to say thank you. Seeing you as an instructor, knowing that someone who looked like me had walked this path and succeeded, that made all the difference. When I wanted to quit, I thought about you and kept going." Cassidy felt emotion well up, but she kept her voice steady. "You didn't keep going because of me. You kept going because you're a Ranger. You earned that tab through your own blood and sweat. Don't ever forget that. And Rodriguez, pass it forward. Someday you'll be the example someone else needs. Make sure you're ready for that responsibility." After 2 years as an instructor, Cassidy was reassigned to the 75th Ranger Regiment headquarters, where she helped develop training protocols and operational doctrine for a new generation of Rangers. It was important work, but she missed the direct leadership, missed the connection to soldiers and missions. She was considering her next career move when she received an unexpected phone call. It was from Staff Sergeant Torres, the soldier who had recruited her all those years ago in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. Torres had retired from the Army and was now working with a veterans organization focused on mentoring young people from disadvantaged backgrounds who were interested in military service. "Major Broussard, I've been following your career. I'm so proud of what you've accomplished. Listen, I'm organizing a mentorship program in Louisiana, specifically targeting kids from rural areas who might not think military service is possible for them. Would you be willing to come speak? Your story could change lives." Cassidy didn't hesitate. "Of course. When do you need me?" A month later, Cassidy found herself back in Louisiana, standing in a high school gymnasium in a parish not far from where she had grown up. The room was filled with teenagers, many of them from backgrounds similar to her own. Rural, poor, underestimated. She looked at their faces and saw herself 20 years earlier, unsure and searching for direction. "My name is Major Cassidy Broussard," she began, her Louisiana drawl still present despite years away. I grew up about 50 miles from here, in a house on stilts in the middle of the bayou. My daddy was a shrimper. We didn't have much money. We didn't have connections or advantages. What we had was each other, the swamp, and a belief that hard work and integrity mattered more than where you came from. She told them her story, not the sanitized recruiting poster version, but the real story. The doubt, the mockery of her accent, the institutional resistance, the failures and setbacks, but also the triumphs, the moments of proving herself, the incredible soldiers she'd served with, and the satisfaction of knowing she'd made a difference. "I'm not going to tell you that military service is easy, or that it's for everyone," she said. "It's hard. It's demanding. There will be times when you want to quit, when people tell you that you don't belong, when the mission seems impossible. But I will tell you this, if I can earn a Ranger tab and lead soldiers in combat, if a girl from the Louisiana swamps with an accent people mocked can make it through Ranger school and deploy 4 times, then you can accomplish whatever you set your mind to. Not because I'm special, but because determination and character matter more than any perceived disadvantage." After her talk, a young woman approached her, maybe 16 years old, wearing worn clothes and carrying a backpack that had seen better days. "Ma'am, I'm Sarah. I want to join the army when I graduate, but my guidance counselor says I should be more realistic. She says people like us don't become officers or rangers. She says I should think about community college and maybe the National Guard." Cassidy knelt down so she was at eye level with Sarah. "Let me tell you something that I wish someone had told me when I was your age. Other people's limited imagination is not your reality. If you want to be a ranger, if you want to serve at the highest level, then pursue that dream with everything you've got. Will it be hard? Yes. Will people doubt you? Absolutely. But will it be worth it? Every single day." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "But what if I fail? What if they're right, and I'm not good?" "Enough," Cassidy smiled gently. "Then you fail and you get back up and you try again. Failure isn't the opposite of success, Sarah. It's part of the path to success. I failed missions in Ranger School. I made mistakes in combat. But I learned from every failure and I kept moving forward. That's what separates people who achieve their dreams from people who don't. Not talent, not advantages, but the refusal to stay down when they get knocked down." She reached into her pocket and pulled out something she'd been carrying since her own Ranger School graduation, the compass her father had given her. "My daddy gave me this when I enlisted. He told me to find my north and the rest would follow. I want you to have it now." Sarah stared at the compass in disbelief. "I can't take this. It's too important." Cassidy pressed it into her hand. "That's exactly why you should have it. Find your north, Sarah. Find what matters to you, what you're willing to fight for, and let that guide you. And when you're standing on the other side of whatever challenge you're facing, when you've achieved something people said was impossible, you pass that compass to someone else who needs it. That's how we lift each other up." 5 years later, Cassidy received a letter at her office in the Pentagon, where she now worked on policy initiatives for the Army. The return address was Fort Benning, Georgia. Inside was a photo of a young woman in Ranger School fatigues, standing in formation, her face streaked with mud but her eyes bright with determination. The note read, "Ma'am, I'm currently in the mountain phase of Ranger School. It's the hardest thing I've ever done, but every time I want to quit, I look at the compass you gave me and I remember what you told me. Find your north. You changed my life. Thank you. Ranger candidate Sarah Mitchell." Cassidy stared at the photo for a long time, feeling the weight of legacy and responsibility and pride. This was what it was all about. Not the medals or the recognition or the personal achievements, but the impact on the next generation. The door she'd helped open for others to walk through. The proof that where you started didn't determine where you could go. That evening, Cassidy sat in her small Pentagon office and reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From the Louisiana bayou to the halls of military power, from being mocked for her accent to being consulted on policy, from fighting for acceptance to being a role model for others. It had been 20 years since she'd first walked into that recruiting station, 20 years of sacrifice, struggle, triumph, and growth. And through it all, the lesson remained the same. Strength came in many forms. Leadership wasn't about volume or bravado, and courage meant showing up even when the odds were stacked against you. She thought about her father, gone now for 5 years, who had taught her to read the swamp and trust her instincts. She thought about Staff Sergeant Torres, who had seen potential in a muddy teenager in the aftermath of a hurricane. She thought about Master Sergeant Carver, who had admitted he was wrong and helped her succeed. She thought about Staff Sergeant Chen and all the Rangers she'd served with, who had trusted her with their lives. And she thought about Sarah Mitchell and all the other young people who would come after, who would face their own battles and doubt and challenges, who would need to know that it was possible. Cassidy pulled out a piece of paper and began to write. Not an official report or a policy brief, but something more personal. A letter to every person who had ever felt like they didn't belong, who had been told they weren't good enough, who had faced institutional barriers and personal doubt. She wrote about the swamps of Louisiana and the mountains of Georgia and the deserts of Afghanistan. She wrote about fear and courage, about failure and resilience, about the difference between meeting a standard and exceeding it. And she wrote about the most important lesson she'd learned, that you don't need permission to be excellent. You just need commitment, integrity, and the courage to keep moving forward even when the path is unclear. When she finished, she read it over once, then filed it away. Maybe someday it would matter. Maybe someday someone would read those words and find the strength to take one more step, to push through one more challenge, to refuse to quit when quitting seemed like the only reasonable option. Or maybe the words themselves didn't matter as much as the life she'd lived, the example she'd set, the doors she'd helped open. Either way, Cassidy Broussard knew she had done what she set out to do all those years ago. She had proven that courage didn't have agenda. That leadership came in many voices, including one with a Louisiana drawl. That the swamps and the mountains and the deserts all taught the same lesson if you were willing to listen. Respect the environment, trust your training, never quit on your people, and always, always find your north. The rest would follow. As she turned off the light in her office and headed home, Cassidy smiled. The journey wasn't over. There were still missions to accomplish, still people to mentor, still barriers to break. But for tonight, she was content knowing that somewhere in Georgia, a young woman named Sarah was learning the same lessons Cassidy had learned, was facing the same challenges Cassidy had faced, and was discovering the same truth that had carried Cassidy through every trial, that the only limits that truly matter are the ones you place on yourself, and Rangers don't accept limits, they overcome them. If you believe that true leadership isn't about being the loudest voice in the room, but the calmest one when everything falls apart, comment Ranger below. Let me know this story resonated with you.